We'll move now on to our second paper. That paper is from Luai Allarakia, and Luai is speaking about the Kuwaiti National Assembly.
So I'm going to be covering the Kuwaiti National Assembly's role in the COVID crisis. In particular, I'm going to see how they dealt with COVID-related laws and how effective they were in doing so. And I want to just start off with like a quick caveat, which is I wasn't aware that I needed to add a theoretical element. I thought this would be like more of a current affairs coverage. So I will try to do something theoretical a little bit towards the end, but apologies for this first draft that may have somewhat, sloppy theory and, method, but, it's a work in progress. Anyway, so the main question is how effective was the Kuwaiti National Assembly at the height of the COVID-19 crisis? It's going to be KNA from henceforth, Kuwaiti National Assembly. It's a useful case because it's an authoritarian regime, but a type that's unaddressed in the literature. It's also interesting because it's a hybrid regime that combines a hereditary structure, executive with an elected legislator. There's a lot of details here. So political parties are not legally sanctioned, but they're also not prohibited. So you have very fluid political and parliamentary blocks in place of parties. You also have ministers appointed by the prime minister, and they become ex officio members of the KNA. They can actually vote on all of the laws, including voting for the speaker in the committee. The only thing they're not allowed to vote on are motions of confidence. The structure of the Kuwaiti legislature looks a little bit like this. Looks exactly like this. So you have a royal family consensus where the emir is appointed, and he appoints the prime minister and the cabinet. The electorate free and fairly elects the National Assembly, with the exception of 1 year, 1967. After that, there haven't been any allegations of fraud. So they freely elect the National Assembly, which has a right to put forth interpellations which can lead to no cooperation with the prime minister or no confidence on any of the ministers. And the emir in turn can respond by a host of measures, the most extreme of which is dissolving the National Assembly. Now, what about lawmaking powers? Well, lawmaking powers are still fairly wide here, and there's a reasonable balance. Still, it tilts a lot more towards the emir, who operates through the cabinet ministers and the prime minister, but still there is a reasonable balance. So the emir can propose, sanction, and promulgate laws. He does so through the cabinet and the prime minister, who's also a member of the royal family. He also has a right to issue emergency decrees should an emergency arise when the National Assembly is not in session or has been dissolved. I should say though, any decree that is passed by the emir, once the KNA is back in session, has to go through a vote by the KNA. If it doesn't pass, it actually does not go through. It doesn't become a law. It only operates when the KNA is not in session. Now, the KNA can actually initiate laws, and no laws can be promulgated unless the KNA passes it, after which it's sanctioned by the emir. Now, I just talked about the decrees, so the emir decrees, so no reason to repeat that again. A couple of key points here which are going to be relevant for our discussion today. Law proposals by MPs are called law proposals per se. They're first sent to the Legislative and Legal Affairs Committee, and they're transferred to the appropriate specialized legislative committee later on. So whatever the area of the law's jurisdiction is. They could die. A lot of these proposals could actually die in the Legislative and Legal Affairs Committee. And in fact, more often than not, they actually do. They actually never make it out of the Legislative and Legal Affairs Committee. Laws proposed by the government, on the other hand, are called draft laws. Why? Because they're considered more clean-cut. They have, legal advisors, so they're also because the government has the upper hand here, and even writing the Constitution. So their laws or proposals are immediately called draft laws, and they are transferred immediately to specialized committees without going through the Legislative and Legal Affairs Committee. So they pass one hurdle much quicker. So it makes sense that more often than not, government draft laws or proposals actually make it out of the appropriate committee. Now, the voting process is a long process. It's a 3-tiered process. I won't go through it because we don't have time. And also, the advantage is all of the laws that were COVID related were expedited through a special constitutional article, which allows for laws of emergency to be expedited and voted on within one session instead of the three-tiered process. Now, oversight powers, due to time constraints, I'm not going to focus on too much when it comes to effectiveness. I'll just explain to you how they work. So members of the KNA, like I said earlier, can interpolate the ministers. They can also put forth motions of confidence. They can be brought forth by 10 members. If these pass, ex officio members cannot vote for it. If these pass, the emir has three choices. He can, if they pass, the minister has to be removed. But when it comes to the prime minister, there's a different procedure. Here, it's called no cooperation. And here the emir has the right to, once the no cooperation passes, to either relieve the prime minister, allow the government or the cabinet to quit or reshuffle or dissolve parliament. Now, how do I measure legislative effectiveness during the COVID-19 crisis and overall? So I use two key metrics, effective legislation and effective oversight. I cover 2 years, which are the years of not COVID per se, because we're still going through this crisis, so I want to be careful with my language, but at the height of the crisis, when there was an actual lockdown, because Kuwait no longer has a lockdown. So I covered the years 2020 and 2021. Coincidentally, both of these years actually covered different parliamentary sessions, because 2020 was the last year of the 2016 session, which was the 15th term, whereas 2021 was the first year of the 2020 16th KNA. So you're actually looking at two parliaments or two different sessions throughout these 2 years. What kind of data am I looking at? Well, I'm looking at MP COVID-related law proposals, government COVID-related draft laws, committee-specific details, COVID-related interpellation details. I match interpellation details with actual government policies, and I look at the outcome of interpellations. Due to time constraints, I'm only going to look at legislative effectiveness, but please feel free to ask me about the oversight aspect of the interpellations. I actually have the data and I'd be more than happy to get into a lot more detail. Okay, so how do we measure effective legislation overall and for my specific purposes? Well, there's numerous measures. I don't want to go through them again due to time constraints, but I'll tell you what the measure I use, which is called a hit rate. It's the percentage of bills that do not die in committees and actually become official laws in the official gazette. This is a measure used by Volden and Weisman to measure the effectiveness of single legislators in Congress. I utilize the same measure, but for the whole assembly. I also look at the substance of laws passed, because if you look at the sheer quantity of laws that made it outside of the committee, these laws could be laws that aren't significant or aren't very important. So it's important to also look at the substance and not just the numbers, the sheer numbers. Now, if we look at legislative effectiveness for the year 2020, which is the last year of the 15th term that was elected in 2016, we find that, and this was a surprise to me because I had assumed that this assembly was, it has a dreadful reputation, and having followed it in 2021, it was absolutely useless. But in 2020, I was shocked to see that it actually did fairly well. So out of 16 COVID-related law proposals that were put forth by this by the KNA, by KNA MPs, only 7 died in the committee, and actually 9 of them became laws. So over 50% of them actually became laws that were published in the official gazette. What's the substance of these laws? Are they all laws that aren't very useful? Well, there's 2 things we notice here. Look at the distribution of the laws and their content. If we look at the 3 laws that were passed, and I need to make it clear here that, like, when I say number of proposals, sometimes MPs submit proposals on specific issues that cover the same law. So essentially, once they go into committees, what the committee does is it consolidates all of these proposals into one law. So in this case, for example, you had 6 laws which had to deal with renters' rights, and they would, allow for the removal of rent payments or postponing them, banning evictions, banning unilateral termination of contracts by landlords. So all of these, there are 6 laws that law proposals that dealt with this. They were consolidated into one law, and that law actually made it out of the committee onto the floor. Same thing with a law that ensures court sessions are not affected, that civil court sessions are not affected by COVID-19. That also made it to the floor and was voted on. There were two laws on, changing or amending a law that deals with infectious diseases. And the amendment added that there should be a higher council of health every time there's a crisis or disaster, and that there should be heavier fines for not complying with public health. There were two proposals, and they both, were consolidated into one law, and they were passed. They made it to the floor outside of the committee. The rest of the laws died in the committee. If you look at the content of the other laws, they aren't necessarily any more important or any less important. In terms of the importance, they are all equally important, but the, so it's kind of hard to see whether this is a good, if substance would tell you that it's a good measure of effectiveness, but I will say this. If we're looking at laws that provided serious relief for citizens, then I would say that the assembly has been moderately effective, moderately to fairly effective in passing a lot of these laws. Now, the last part is to look at, once the laws make it to the floor, whether they were passed or not. So here I divide the laws into draft laws by the government, which, like I said, they make it to the floor, so I didn't separate them because they almost immediately made it to the floor, and proposals by MPs. If we look at the distribution of these laws, we will find that the only laws that were voted down by the Assembly were actually draft laws by the government. The other ones that were approved by Parliament were either proposed by MPs and made it out of committees, or they were jointly, there were joint proposals by MPs and draft laws by governments that were sort of consolidated into one. So if we're looking at this also as a measure of effectiveness, the KNA in 2020, the 15th term, was actually able to vote down two unpopular laws, which the government proposed. One of them was a law to provide sort of stimulus to local banks. And the main sticking point was that the MPs wanted this to only apply to medium to small businesses, whereas the government said this should be an overall stimulus, or because fiscal policy should not discriminate between who receives it, because some of these big banks also have considerable deposits, and it would affect the economy drastically. The MPs said no, unless you remove the big banks or the big companies, we're really not going to vote for this law, and they voted it down. The other one is a law addressing the emergence of corona pandemic's effect on the labor market. Some of the provisions of this law actually allows employers to reduce pay by 50% if employers are working from home, or if they can't work due to shutdowns. And so the MPs thought that this was an unfair provision or a shaky provision, and they voted down the law. The other laws that were approved by Parliament, again, like they have to do with providing, postponing installments due for defaulting clients, on family support funds, on creating a health council and strengthening fines or increasing punitive fines on people that don't abide by public health laws or provisions or regulations. They also passed laws or approved laws that had to do with the issuance of basically laws that allow people to not be affected by any kind of disruption to the commercial and civil court procedures if there's a pandemic. They also passed laws, again, like providing a lot of relief for renters. So given the substance of these laws, and given also that the laws that were approved were almost all, MP proposals or shared MP proposals with the government, it seems that this is I would say that it was fairly effective. Now, the last part is looking at the next year, which is 2021. This was a year where a new election took place during the pandemic, and a new parliament came to power. Now here you have a term that was marred with executive legislative tension from the beginning, from the opening session. There were tensions over electing the speaker. There were tensions over committee assignments. As a result, there were interpellations even before the opening session and throughout the session. And what happened was the government made things worse by basically annulling the election of one of the opposition MPs, and also by passing this, vote that was fairly controversial to essentially postpone potential interpellations. So interpellations that aren't even on the table, that haven't even put forth. If there's a potential to put them forth, the government said that I want to essentially postpone the Parliament's ability to do this for about 2 years. And so the Parliament said, none of this is detailed in the rules of procedure. This is completely illegal. And the government had a response, and a reading, through its speaker that said, no, this is legal. And so again, the result was tension throughout the whole assembly, which led to a lot of spectacles, a lot of theatrics, including, the opposition MPs walking in with loudspeakers and yelling, towards the ears of the Speaker of the KNA, so he wouldn't be able to read out agenda items, causing him to cancel sessions. There were MPs sitting on cabinet seats and basically having lunch, preventing the ministers from sitting down and actually, starting the sessions. So the majority of the sessions for this, the majority of the first set of plenary sessions for the first year of the 16th legislative term, which is 2021, were essentially canceled or shut down. As a result, you only had 2 COVID laws that were voted on. And both of these COVID laws were actually only put forth as a result of a government maneuver when the government knew that the opposition would be boycotting the session and sitting outside of the parliament. And so they tried to pass these 2 laws, one of which was popular and one of which was a government proposal in the first place, to basically embarrass the opposition in 2 ways. One, to pass the law that it wanted to pass, the bank relief law. And secondly, to also pass a popular law without the government, without the opposition's presence, to say, well, look, this opposition doesn't care about citizens. It's sitting outside instead of voting on popular laws. So this was a very ineffective, beginning to the to the 16th term. And in comparison to 2020, it was fairly ineffective. Not fairly ineffective, it was completely ineffective. Now, what are my tentative conclusions and prospects for future research? Because this is really less than even a first draft. It's just the beginning of a research project. The KNA was surprisingly effective during the COVID crisis, despite its reputation as a parliament characterized by perpetual stasis and its semi-democratic and authoritarian context. Why do I say this? Well, because the several laws that provided serious reliefs for citizens during the most extreme phase of the COVID crisis, which is 2020, were actually passed. So that leads me to say that it was fairly surprisingly effective. Why? Because the reputation of this, of the KNA globally is of a parliament that is in perpetual stasis. There's always executive legislative deadlock. Now, the effective of the KNA is actually contingent on not being marred in executive legislative battles over the rules of the game. So if that happens, then, and I think this is fairly intuitive and maybe obvious, then you aren't going to have an effective, legislative making or rule-making body. Okay, all right, or even oversight body. Now, it's very hard for me to generalize based on what I said, because I haven't made any comparisons, nor do I have a strong theoretical basis, at least yet, because I really was taking a sort of current affairs approach until I realized that, there were other people that were doing theoretical, angles. But I do think that I can open the space for comparisons with similar regime types, or even democracies. Similar regime types meaning hybrid regimes, which combine elected legislators with an unelected executive, or you have both branches elected, but with a severely uneven playing field, for example, for elections. We could also have a basis for comparison with, over parliamentary effectiveness during times of crisis. What determines this? Is it the case that parliaments where the rules of procedure are more clear-cut tend to be more effective overall during times of crisis, or overall? There are multiple questions, and I think this will be in the next iteration of the paper, and I'm